Thank you all for being here. I'm looking forward to this session very much, having read both of the papers. Our speakers are Rose Cherubin of George Mason University and Matt Childers of Kendall College of Ferris State University. The procedure that we're going to follow here is pretty straightforward. Since I'm commenting on both papers, we're going to have Rose present her talk, followed by Matt. Each will have about 20 minutes. I'll then say a few things and open up the floor to discussion. And we don't have a huge number of people, but I would suggest we do it this way. If you would like to speak, you could simply type into the chat box the word speak. And assuming that that doesn't get the dogs in the background barking, that will allow for me to call on people in a reasonable order. So with that, let me scroll to the top of it. Why don't we turn to our two speakers? First, Rose Cherubin on nature, mortals, and truth in Parmenides.
Thank you so much for that, Bill. I'm going to try to share a screen. Let's see if any of that works. So I want to first thank Larry Cahoon for organizing this twice and doing such an incredible job. And I want to thank the tech staff for their incredible support these past few days. And thank also Daniel Stambovsky and Tyler Tridden for having helped me with some strange technical difficulties uploading what is, I guess we'd call this paper. And again, thank Bill for his patience and forbearance and the interactions we've had so far about this. So let's go to the next slide. I came to this from some intertwined problems, and it seemed that to approach each problem meant you had to approach the others. So one is how to understand Parmenides fragments taken together. And that, of course, involves understanding the portion of the goddess's speech that is supposed to represent the opinions of mortals, which involves understanding how and why these opinions might be untrustworthy or deception, but also afford descriptive or hermeneutical efficacy, which I'll discuss in a moment. And these sections on opinions have very often refer to or use the terms physis and phuo, nature and to grow or culminate. And there are a lot of questions about what these terms meant or connoted in and before Parmenides' time, which is somewhat different from what they meant or mean or connoted in Aristotle. So maybe one thing that this paper is going to do is to show just what a tremendous effort and what tremendous decisions Aristotle made in coming up with his description of what physis is. And it'll say something about how physis enters philosophical inquiry. Okay. The fragments of Parmenides include 3 mentions of physis and 3 of the related verb phuo. And all of the mentions of physis occur in the part of the poem that discusses what we would call natural phenomena, astronomy and physiology, which, given some of the comments by the goddess in the poem, have normally been thought to represent something that the goddess thinks are untrustworthy. But at the same time, she uses physis and phuo in remarks that have some descriptive and heuristic efficacy, which by descriptive efficacy, I mean that these passages and the categories of light and night that they invoke present an account of observable phenomena that's at least as consistent with observation as and more internally consistent than other ways mortals have of describing our world. By heuristic efficacy, a wonderful phrase I owe to Bill Wians, I mean that these passages offer an account that's more conducive to investigation of the observable world than other mortal accounts. For example, recent work argues that Parmenides' account of the shapes of the Earth and the Moon and the relationships between Earth, Moon, and Sun would enable one to explain why a lunar eclipse looks the way it does, why the Moon's phases change the way they do, and so on. But what is this physis, this nature, this whatever that Parmenides is referring to when he talks about the physis of the sun and the moon? The sole Homeric use of the term reflects a situation in which some of a whole is not usually directly accessible to humans and is only or mainly accessible through divine intervention. And in this passage, as you can see, the fusus of the thing seems to be, or at least seems to include, something like the appearance of the whole, the way the whole looks. Might include more than that, but it certainly includes that. In the passage, Hermes offers to give Odysseus a pharmacon that will render Kirke's spells ineffective on humans. And this is the molly plant or moldy plant. And Odysseus reports that Hermes pulled the plant out of the ground and showed its fusus. As Clay and others have pointed out, all we know is that Hermes has shown Odysseus the appearance of the plant. Without the god's help, it looks like humans can only see the flower. So fusus starts to look like the form or appearance of a whole, and in a sense, the distinguishing characteristics of it. We might want to ask whether this Homeric use would also comprehend what we would call the ultimate nature of the thing, the way the thing as a whole really is, or something like Aristotle's sense of the way something is always or for the most part. But the passage neither implies nor eliminates that possibility, nor does it indicate anything about whether there's an account of how the plant works, what the plant's made of, how it grows, that sort of thing. Now, Parmenides' close contemporaries so 5th century, use the term to refer either to bodily frame or constitution, and sometimes to culmination of growth. So in the Pindar example, we're looking at certainly somebody's bodily frame, but also the sort of the full strength to which they've grown. It's Aeschylus as well. Especially if it refers to a bodily frame or a culmination or peak or a process that has a culmination, fusus may again evoke a whole of which only some aspects are available to apprehend in a given context. These two occurrences that I've just shown explicitly identify an acme or a peak of physical form or development, and the peak form is not evident or necessarily inferable at other points in the process. And the process is not evident from the peak form, but each is available as what it is, or is understood as what it is. There's the peak or the process, insofar as each is seen as part of a whole that the two compose. So neither Homer, Aeschylus, nor Pindar, or others in the 5th century, I didn't go into the Hippocratics, that's a whole other story that I could go into, none of them use the term to mean something like nature as opposed to human handicraft, nature as explanation, either as explanans or explanata, nature, or none of them refer to the nature of the thing as what the thing sort of really is, or how it really works, or what its source of motion or change or standstill, as in Aristotle, is. At least they don't mention these things in a way that would separate them from the way the thing appears. It's not clear whether they are conceptually separating these things yet. Nor, importantly, do their uses of the term connote a complete understanding of the way something is. So, for example, the prior example, the Prometheus example, may imply that for humans, learning the fusus of something leaves a lot unknown. So I'd like to propose some ways in which this and the Homeric example might be connected to Parmenides' references to fusus, which would not be exactly the same, but may contain some of the same elements. So as Clay emphasized, Hermes again has shown Odysseus the appearance of the whole of something, whereas unaided humans can only encounter a part or an aspect. And similarly, the Aeschylus and Pindar examples have this. Our lack of access to the appearance of the whole is due not to some defect in our sensory apparatus necessarily, but to the fact that unlike the gods, we mortals don't have what it takes to get the plant out of the ground, in the Odysseus case, to see its roots. What it is that we don't have, gods can accomplish everything. What don't we have? Do we not have strength? Do we not have the know-how? Do we not have the finesse? Do we not know what it is that we don't have? The text doesn't specify. So I want to suggest that the experiment I want to suggest the experiment of interpreting Parmenides' uses of physis as referring to something about the way a whole is as it appears once we acknowledge something that isn't usually accessed. So the physis, I'm going to propose, joins a commonly accessible aspect and an aspect that isn't usually accessed, at least not at the same time. So maybe each aspect could be accessed, but not at the same time. And do want to say this happens on at least 3 levels. Now, this would put physis somewhat at odds with aletheia, usually translated as truth, as that was understood at the time, because to convey the aletheia is to convey the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, traced to its origins and its implications. It's supposed to be the opposite, not only of falsehood, but of oblivion, of escaping notice. That's the etymological root of it. And of course, the way of inquiry that Parmenides goddess recommends is the one she says is most oriented toward aletheia. So physis and aletheia may be far from one another, they may conflict, they may be complexly connected, but that's the question that I'm hoping to at least start to address. Certainly not complete. Now, in Homer, showing the physis of something involves showing what the whole looks like, but there's no sense that this appearance is either explanatory or revealing of origins and properties. In Parmenides, we'll see showing the physis of celestial objects involves bringing our attention to something that cannot necessarily be seen on its own or directly, and yet paying attention to that thing does not by itself present the origins or properties of the phenomenon. So here's one of the examples, learning about the sun and the physis and the moon, the physis of the sun and the moon, and the sun's deeds may actually render some things visible and some things invisible, that render some things unseen, or its influence may be unseen. So the apparent inseparability or even interdependence of accessible and not usually accessible simultaneously aspects extends beyond the sun-moon system to the light-night framework itself and to its relationship to the way in which one is to say and conceive of what is on the road of inquiry that the goddess recommends as associated with aletheia. So here's Stockholm, slide 10. Insofar as physis in Homer involved something unseen, possibly joined to something seen, there could be a connection to the description of the sun here, as I've noted. The moon's physis is also mentioned in 10, and one thing that we can glean from this brief fragment is that the physis of something is not the same as the thing's deeds or workings. So here, nature is not the workings, apparently, or physis, which comes to mean nature, is not the workings of something. It's distinct from the workings or the deeds. Fragments 14 and 15 indicate that the moon is only seen by the sun's light, so that its surface is otherwise unseen. By day, often both sun and moon can be seen, but at night only the moon is seen, and that, according to Parmenides, is because of the work of the unseen sun. Similarly, if the moon isn't visible in the sky, that can also be sometimes because the sun is too bright. Now, there would also be something unseen, and I think this may be significant, if there is a dark side of the moon. And in fact, Moralatos and Graham have been arguing that this account in Parmenides seems to require the view that the phases of the moon are something that we see when one side of an unchanging spherical moon is illuminated from different angles, as opposed to being something we see because the moon is changing shape, which would mean that at least some of the moon is invisible to us at all times, so there's a dark side of the moon. Some of this will connect to the idea that light and night are both necessary in order to sense anything. The sun can't be seen alone because it's too blinding and nothing can be seen in undifferentiated light, but the sun can be seen in and through its reflections and around its obstacles that it causes to cast shadows, such as eclipses. The moon cannot be seen on its own, but it can be seen if it's blocking or reflecting the light of the sun. So the fact that the moon has a side that we don't see, and the fact that the moon as a whole looks as it does and appears to move as it does, in some sense because it has a side we can't see, suggests that Parmenides is aware of what, and I'll be grateful for corrections to this term, what might be called structural obstacles to humans' perception and understanding. knowing the physis regarding the moon includes being aware that there's something we don't perceive and can't perceive on our own. And it doesn't, as far as we can tell from the fragments, necessarily include an explanation of why that is. That is an explanation of what we might call the ultimate nature of the moon, or its first principle of motion and standstill, or something like that. And we get to Parmenides finally. Get to I guess the second question of Parmenides finally. A look at fragment B16 raises a related question. Is Parmenides signaling something systematic about mortals' limitations and lacks, and thus our mortality and our dependence? Fragment 16 connects nous, mind or awareness or intention, to a blending of limbs. It seems to say that, and I say seems to say because there are some arguments over the syntax here. It seems to say that the physis of limbs in humans is the same as that which apprehends or understands, and that what is conceived or intended or in awareness is the more or the full. Now, ancient commentators pretty strongly suggest that Parmenides associates this with an idea that like apprehends like, or like perceives like, that what you perceive or apprehend correlates with what's involved in the perceiving organ or faculty. Theophrastus, was our most detailed source, notes that in this case, according to Parmenides' opinions of mortals, our bodies, like everything else, are composed of light and night. So the proportion of light and night in what we each perceive or apprehend will match that of our own particular composition, of the blending of our limbs. From this, I think we can see how that might lead to our missing or our failing to sense, our failing to grasp some features of the world. If in a given situation, there was proportionally more light, than in your own frame, then you wouldn't be able to apprehend what exceeded your own proportion. It's possible then, even likely, that no human could perceive or apprehend extreme levels or proportions of light or night. And there's actually some note in Theophrastus to that effect. Now, this fragment also seems to me to suggest another level of failure to notice, another level of limitation to human awareness. In the fragment, the light in us perceives or apprehends light in the environment, and the night in us perceives or apprehends the night around us. There's no indication that the light or night in us perceives or apprehends itself. We just don't know. How, if at all, then do we know, or how are we aware that light and night are in fact responsible for phronane understanding, or that they are fundamental to the composition of the world? Now, my guess is that Parmenides is floating the idea that we don't know this, at least not on our own. And that insofar as we do have awareness of it, this awareness comes, first of all, from the goddess. And second of all, it's expressed through categories that humans have simply laid down. It's positive categories the goddess shows to be flawed. We laid down these categories of light and night, and the goddess is pointing them out to us, or pointing out to us that we did this. We can observe that the light-night conception has, provides a way to note customary divisions and distinctions among things, a way to account for sensations that doesn't involve claiming that anything absolutely is not, or that not to be a certain way is not to be at all. Let's skip that part. Mortals might not explicitly claim that what is light and night, but they, or we, do claim, seems to be, that something isomorphic to light and night is fundamental. And insofar as we do take something like that as fundamental, the goddess indicates we do so by laying down or laying up opinions or judgments to name forms, suggesting we don't know these judgments to be adequate or accurate or not, and that they're neither laid down nor gods, nor known to be adequate and accurate reflections of the way what is. Now, this may be helpful in understanding how it is that, according to the goddess, mortals' opinions are not trustworthy, and the laying down of the light-night conceptual framework itself represents wandering on the parts of mortals, yet at the same time, the account of the relationship between the moon and the sun, and likely some other astronomical and physiological points, are supposed to have some descriptive and heuristic efficacy. They're supposed to be accurate in some sense, or up to some point, or to work in the sense of enabling us to communicate about and effectively use observed regularities. This is fragment 9. Concluding, the linked accessibility and inaccessibility may also be reflected at a further level. that of the requisites of inquiry as outlined by the goddess, which include both an acknowledgement of division and distinction and motion and change, on a road of inquiry we have to take certain steps, and the acknowledgement of what is as unitary, undivided, and undifferentiated, not susceptible to change or coming to be or perishing, which I found some very, very interesting ways of trying to bring out based on what I heard yesterday in a number of the talks, for which I'm very grateful, and did not have time to interpolate here. Articulating any statement or identifying anything or saying that anything is involves distinctions and difference and thus negation. To try to articulate what is implies that something else is not, but not that not being or what is not. To try to articulate what is implies that something is not, but that very not being or what is not is obscured by the assertion that something is. To identify anything or say that it is in a way that supports inquiry and is oriented toward aletheia according to Parmenides' goddess requires that one suppose that what is stable, ungenerating, unperishing, one, undifferentiated, etc. This side of the supposition is obscured by the identification of things to inquire about and the very framework through which we identified what is as stable, ungenerated, etc. The differentiation of the things that we need to invoke in order to inquire is made inaccessible in the conceiving or intending or awareness of what is as unified. The process of inquiry, the taking of steps, requires a supposition of orderedness, for which Parmenides invokes Dike and Anke and Moira, and necessity of inference, for which he invokes Ananke, which obscures the underlying stability and unity that the process must always suppose. And the supposition of stability and unity makes the articulation of motion through steps inaccessible. So therefore, in some ways, the notion of aletheia is a problem within Parmenides' fragments, and I wonder whether it's deliberately so. Given what we mortals lay down, giving the aletheia, the truth, will involve holding together suppositions and conceptions that appear to be interdependent and also either mutually incompatible or mutually obscuring. And it's also on the basis of these suppositions and conceptions that we frame the notion of aletheia. The very laying down or laying up of the names is also obscured in earlier notions of giving the aletheia. In this way, making available the presence of aspects that obscure one another and pointing out the laying down of names that is obscured in our use of them is giving the aletheia in the sense of making sure that no aspect of what is, including the suppositions of our account of it, is consigned to oblivion. Yet due to this same laying down, aletheia as complete transparency appears to be beyond mortal's grasp. Parmenides' use of physis would then be consistent with this. Perhaps, too, such a use offers a clue as to why the goddess often refers to us as mortals rather than humans. In offering to have her listener learn the physis of celestial things or of the human body, of understanding, the goddess seems to highlight those features that reflect the conflicts and gaps that mortals' ways of conceiving of the world induce. Our mortality on this view is more than a matter of a limited time span on Earth. It's also a constant condition of lack that offers the possibility for inquiry and for aletheia as progressive opening. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rose.
Sure.
So I think we'll go on to Matt Childers' paper. And you know what, give me just a second so I can open it up here. And Matt, I hope you're able to keep an eye on the chat box just in case there's a technical problem like we just saw. I'll send you a message to let you know. And
I will do my best.
I know it's hard to do all of that. So our second speaker is Matt Childers, who will be speaking on naturalism and the uniformity of nature.
Yeah, thanks, everybody. So at this point, I'm somewhat likely to kind of tread on a lot of notions and themes much discussed by now. So I don't feel unoriginal. I feel that I'm a pioneer with all of these great scholars like yourself. And also, again, thanks to Larry and all of the great presenters so far. This paper was inspired by some long-held worries I've had about how entities that are not strictly speaking part of nature, or at least so said, can nonetheless have a nature or be said to have a nature. and why some naturalists might find that notion somewhat uncomfortable. So the paper is pretty speculative. I hope this is the right venue for speculative metaphysics. It's pretty controversial too in that respect, and for this reason, I'm really eager to hear everyone's comments, especially Bill's, and objections, perhaps most of which I myself would agree with too. So I'm understanding, already getting controversial, understanding metaphysics as concerning the fundamental nature of reality. And metaphysical naturalism, at least in the scope of this paper, is the metaphysical thesis that the fundamental nature of reality is such that everything is fundamentally part of nature. Or said another way, fundamentally, nature is all that is. So this suggests, I think, that the natural and nature are perhaps among the basic ontological commitments of naturalism. Hopefully controversial in a good way so far, but let's spice it up, right? So I think, as we're pretty familiar by now, among its many senses, there are at least two primary realist senses of the term nature. The first is the particular or special sense, as when we say things that the nature of X is F, say the nature of dogs is to bark. And the second, of course, is the universal, or maybe we'll call it the general sense of nature, as we say when nature is beautiful, or the universe speaks to me, or the cosmos is mysterious or something. So clearly the first admits of some kind of pluralization, lends itself to that. So it's not incoherent to say that many things have a nature. The determiner is suggestive of that. And it's questionable, at least for the latter sense, that it seems to be at least necessarily singular, perhaps monistic as well. So I think a lot of thinkers, recent and not so recent, claim that both of these senses suggested some kind of unity in themselves. So starting with the special or the particular sense, just taking a few of these here, it's understood as all of the attributes which belong to X in virtue of what X is, everything which is of itself without voluntary human intervention, or that property, there's a contemporary definition of nature's, the property which is the conjunction of all of its natural or non-relational or monadic properties. We're familiar, I'm sure, with that sense. We've talked about it already through the conference. After all, the etymology of the term universe is that that which is turned into one or combined into a whole or all together. So the general or universal sense of nature is the sum total of all things, everything which is, or to take Oppe's grand definition here, a unique thing of which all things are part, or everything, the sum of all things, the total, the most inclusive things, the universe, et cetera, right? Okay, this is all well tread so far, but what do I want to suggest a little bit here? I want to say nudge a modestly suggestive case for the claim that maybe there's a plausible connection between these two senses, which extend just beyond homonymy, which give us reasons for adopting a sort of naturalism, maybe a rare sort of naturalism, according to which anything with a nature is necessarily part of nature. That's, I guess, the controversial claim here, that necessarily X has a nature if and only if X is a part of nature. So I'll call that just the thesis uniformity throughout this presentation. So this kind of naturalism, I guess what I could call monistic naturalism, or maybe M-naturalism as I'll call it, that's not its most popular form. I think most naturalists, at least in metaphysics, are pluralists, owing to the legacy and dominance of David Lewis and maybe neo-Humeans of his stripe. That nevertheless, I think offers, I want to offer understanding this kind of naturalism, I think offers a new way to interpret the so-called and maybe now neglected so-called principle of the universe, the principle of the uniformity of nature, at least in the favor of naturalism. So I want to advance interpretation of these two senses of nature to at least suggest some kind of deep metaphysical relationship that I think has been neglected by, but maybe advantageous to the service of some contemporary naturalists so inclined. So there are instances of philosophical history, perhaps starting with Pythagoras, where the particular sense of nature is used as a kind of pars pro toto, that is a term wherein the part of the whole represents the whole. Some examples here, we refer to, nice wheels means your car. We say, hey, look at that suit over there, that's a business person, or, I want boots on the ground, we want soldiers, right? So at least among the Greeks, to my knowledge, the orderliness of the particulars of the world, say the seasons, the heavens, flora, and fauna, were thus attributed, maybe starting with Pythagoras, perhaps others, I'm sure, were thus attributed to the world at large, since cosmos means well-ordered system as a whole. So in this vein, the two senses can be related, in some sense, metonymically, right? So nature in general as a totem pro parte, right? A term which in which the whole, call it X, is used to refer to parts of X, call them Y, right? We talk about the USA won the gold. They mean the US Olympic team, or someone might say death to America. They mean the USA, or some Soviet might say, damn the West, and they mean the USA and Western Europe, right? So going back to the thesis in question, I think a possible connection between these two senses of nature is suggested in the seeming equivalence of intuitive ubiquitous claims, as when we say things like it's in the nature of X to be F, X is F by nature, and X has a or an F nature, right? I don't know how many of you speak like that, but I guess we're all philosophers, so we do. So I think these and other such ubiquitous claims or locutions at least suggest a connection between natures and nature in the general sense, in the following sense. And this is the uniformity thesis. What ultimately makes X what X is, its nature, is in some way given to it by something else upon which X ontologically depends. So we hear this in, say, claims like humans are by nature political animals, or speaking isn't natural to humans because it's a great gift which derives to them by nature. So I think naturally the naturalist would, or maybe should, at least some naturalists should suggest that this thing is the general or universal nature itself. So in defense of that, I think the naturalists could extend this connection between the two primary senses of nature as reflected in a relatively forgotten, I think, concept, which makes significant use of this relationship between the primary senses of nature, as mentioned. And that's this relationship or the concept of the macrocosm and the microcosm. I'll just call that the analogy. So without getting into too much history, I think there's some evidence that the analogy was recognized and employed, maybe hinted at, suggested at, or even in some cases, perhaps almost outright endorsed by a lot of philosophers over Western philosophical history. You find it in ancient Greeks, Neoplatonists, medievals, somewhat prominent during the Renaissance and early mid-modern periods. So searching without hopefully too much confirmation bias, it seems at least to crop up in a lot of places, pretty weakly in some cases to pretty strongly in others, especially with, say, Spinoza and some philosophers in the Renaissance. So traditionally, the analogy was held to relate the natures of humans as a part of the universe to the universe itself, right? So as Collingwood explains in his The Idea of Nature, the analogy held, he says that the world of nature as a whole is explained as a macrocosm analogous to this microcosm, namely that of the structure and anatomy of human bodies, right? So I want to extend this a little bit. Robert Ziemkowski says of the analogy, the microcosm and macrocosm are two aspects of a theory, understanding individual human beings as a little world whose composition and structure correspond to that of the universe, or the great world. So cosmos, as we all know, at the time implied order, a general sense, and some harmonious and beautiful arrangement of parts in an organic system. So the suggestion here, for the sake of some naturalists, I'll say, is that the scope of the analogy be maximized, broadened as much as possible to the natures of all existing beings, humans included. I don't want to suggest that we, if we're sympathetic with naturalism, that we should therefore go back to occultists or alchemists of old or anything like that. I think for good reason, the analogy, at least as between humans and the universe, the structure of humans anatomically and the universe itself, it kind of fell out of favor in the Renaissance and the early modern periods, not just due to the maturity of astronomy, but also it was ushered in by the resurgence of various forms of pluralistic naturalism, like forms of atomism in the early modern period. I think that hastened, maybe for good reason, the neglect of this analogy, at least as stated as a relation between human anatomy, human structure, and the universe itself. So that said, again, I want to suggest that the contemporary naturalists, at least some of them anyway, that they extend the scope beyond mere human nature to natures in general, all natures. So according to George Conger, the expanded version of this analogy holds that while portions of the world vary in size, they nevertheless exhibit similarities in structures and processes, indicating that one portion imitates another on a different scale, right? And so Lovejoy's comment about the term nature being most protean, something that's been a theme of the conference, I think is most clearly seen in this context, is nicely anticipated by Emerson, at least Lovejoy's comment anticipated by Emerson, that the fable of Proteus has a cordial truth. A leaf, a drop, a crystal, a moment in time is related to the whole and partakes in the perfection of the whole. Each particle is a microcosm and faithfully renders the likeness of the world. So I think one can begin to see that in moving beyond mere homonymy and understanding the ontological dependence, maybe mereologically or even constitutively, the naturalist is afforded at least one intuitive, traditional, and coherent sense, maybe, of that thesis, that naturalist thesis, that everything is, in some sense, that's where the controversy is, what sense, everything is, in some sense, part of nature. And this suggests that where, the pluralistic naturalists may understand the analogy as one of course, analogs, right? The M-naturalist, I want to suggest, may permissibly translate the microcosm-macrocosm relation as one of homologs, not strictly analogs. So for the M-naturalist, one way that the relation between the microcosm and the macrocosm here of natures and nature may be seen or interpreted, at least, is to understand nature qua whole as an ontologically necessary condition for anything to have a nature. So seen another way, the two aforementioned primary realist senses of the term are related, given that the truth maker for statements which employs this the particular sense of nature are in a way the entity or entities which the universal sense picks out. I think historically, this account of the relationship was most closely hinted at by monists. We see this among not just Jonathan Schaffer as a contemporary M-naturalist, but others as well. So we see this in Spinoza, where the whole conditions the natures of the parts, and natures, in some sense, were but modes of the whole. So in this vein, I think that the relation between the microcosm as the specific nature and the macrocosm as the general nature is expressed in Spinoza's contention here that particular things are nothing but affections of nature's attributes or modes, by which its attributes are, he says, expressed in a certain and determinate way, with some license to Spinoza. So I think the sentiment is most explicitly reflected in this distinction. We've already talked about it during the conference between natura naturata and natura naturans, explicitly in Spinoza. The former referring to nature in the general sense with some license, and the former in the particular sense here. So natures are whatever follow from the necessity of nature's nature for Spinoza, or from any of nature's attributes. That is to say, all of the modes of its attributes insofar as they are considered as entities which are in nature as a whole, and thus, he says, can neither be nor be conceived without it. So I think if we understand the microcosmos and macrocosmos relation here as one of homology, natures can be construed mereologically as parts of a whole with the nature of the universe as maybe its improper part, suggesting the nature of any nature qua part, ontologically, as ontologically depending on and perhaps the expression of the existence of nature itself. Maybe this is fodder for the claim, somewhat disputed now, but the often repeated claim that the Greeks were the discoverers of nature in some sense, or among the many discoverers, surely. So I think everything then, thus, everything within nature that exists is natural precisely because natures are but expressions or parts of nature itself. The grounds for a kind of naturalism, at least a hazy one, begin to emerge. The M-naturalist may treat a definite particular entity as cosmic, a specific suborder of the general order, with each individual manifesting an objective, identifiable structure of definite properties, as if it was just kind of a wee universe unto itself, right? A microcosm. So natures are, in some sense, the general nature expressed within the thing that has a nature. Okay. So this said, I think the M-naturalist is thus afforded a view where the nature of anything is but an exemplification of the special nature as a microcosm in the macrocosm of the general nature, each part of the whole being plausibly understood as connected to it, and others in virtue of instantiating a particular way or some aspect, maybe to use Spinoza's language, a mode of the whole, a special order of the most general order, the cosmos itself. So assuming this kind of naturalism, it's quite appropriate, I think, to describe the properties of some given entity as its nature, as we do. And from that, the M-naturalist can permissibly interpret natures as themselves mere parts of the universal nature, which is a whole simplicator in some way, while understanding natures, these microcosmoi, we might call them, as qualified wholes, right? They are a little cosmoi, but they're not, strictly speaking, fundamental in any way. Hence the monism you see is coming through. And that implies then that the picture is kind of reversed for the pluralistic naturalist. Natures as parts are these are fundamental, right? Consistent with pluralism. This is why Jonathan Schaffer calls his monism priority monism, right? So, how am I doing on time? I have a few more slides.
Yeah, you can take another 5 minutes if you need it. You're
Perfect.
doing well.
Okay, thanks a lot. I think I need it. So I think a representative of priority naturalism, or P-naturalism, the best one at least, is of course David Lewis, as we know. He calls them these little entities which compose the Humean mosaic of nature. They comprise, for him, this plenum of discrete, concrete quality spaces, maximal sums of which are wholly distinct microcosmoi. Of course, his possible worlds view. Similarly, each possible world itself is but just an infinite plenitude of other big, as he says, big, discrete, maximal sums, combinations and classes of which, as we probably know, these serve as truth makers for any logically possible proposition. So Lewis's P-naturalism thus has it that the fundamental discreta of each world, themselves being discrete among themselves, are in some sense a microcosm of themselves of an aggregate, a pluriverse, we might call them, of fundamental discrete macrocosmoi, right? Indeed, while Lewis denies that composition's identity, he does admit that the relationship between wholes and their parts, he says, is strikingly analogous, right? He denies that mere logical sums commit him to things over and above the sums of the discreta. So strictly speaking, the P-naturalist of his stripe, perhaps, of this sort does not actually admit of a universe simplicator, but we might say a pluriverse of entities which are at best kind identical. As Mark Heller says of Lewis's view, he posits many universes within a single pluriverse, which necessitates disconnected manifolds among them. Okay. So I think at best the relationship for the P-naturalist between the two primary senses of nature, they want to buy into the analogy, so to speak, it roughly parallels the relation between maybe set and subset, or maybe more controversially, species and genus. I don't want to go down that road with all the Aristotelians probably bristling at that suggestion, so we'll put that aside. But I think they are related in the manner of hyponym and hyponym pairs, like as Iowa and Michigan are related to the state of state, right? The concept state, or K2 and Olympus Mons are to mountain. So because I think the relata of these are discrete and heterogeneous, the P-naturalists may consistently maintain that natures and nature are, at best, perhaps, proper analogs, therefore, but they're not homologous, they're not homologs, right? So I think this is, for this reason, and we can analogize the analogy to the concept that comes about in biology, right? Different structures with distinct biological grounds evolved independently and are proximally discontinuous with respect to their evolutionary lineage. Those are analogous structures, like bee wings, bat wings, perch and fins, dolphin fins. They are, broadly similar functions, but at least proximately, not going back too far, they have distinct evolutionary grounds. So on Lewis's P-naturalism, both the analogous parts, such as intra-world qualities, and wholes, worlds themselves, have much the same basic functions or theoretical roles, right? So I think the point underscores why the M-naturalists should argue that the relationship between the two primary senses of nature are homologs or homologous. I think on M-naturalism, nature and natures are related as holonym-meronym pairs, such as the relationship of trunk and leaf to tree, or paw and tail to dog, right? These are holological and mereological terms denoting constituent parts of a whole, indicating a certain continuity, not discontinuity among them. And I think the relationship between continuity and proper parted is at least noted by Ronald Hepburn. He says, is to count humans as part of the part and parcel of nature emphasizes the continuity of human, animal, organic, and inorganic worlds. So I think applied mutatis mutandis to natures, it follows that if all natures are part of nature, then the nature of the elements of all these worlds, Hepburn mentions anyway, will also promise some degree of continuity, at least fundamentally so. And so, unlike biological analogs, homologs in biology, as we know, have different functions, wings, flippers, and hands, but they do have at least the same structure fundamentally. And similarly, if nature itself and the natures which constitute it, in some sense, are homologous and maybe homoiomorous, it's entirely possible that some subcosmic natures, X and Y, are quite distinct. But insofar as they are homologs, they are ultimately continuous in their nature, in nature. They all have the same ground, ultimately, nature itself, thus making M-naturalists like Jonathan Schaffer and Spinoza maybe a little happy in that sense. So almost finished here. For these reasons, I think the M-naturalist can own that nature and natures are related in the manner of homoiomorous or like-partedness entities in their parts. These are entities whose parts are of the same nature as that of the whole of which they are, in fact, a part. More specifically, an entity is homoiomorous if and only if all parts Y of X have the same nature, call it F as X. Okay. Moving on a little bit here. I want to say then that mutatis mutandis, the sympathetic naturalist may therefore claim that some entity X is homoiomorous if and only if all of its parts have the same fundamental nature. And interpreted thusly, the nature of anything has a nature necessarily, the nature of anything that has a nature necessarily has within it some basic continuity with the universal nature of which it's a part, no matter how seemingly remote or distinct or queer, to use Mackey's term, it might be. In sum, then, to have a nature is to be fundamentally natural or part of nature. We therefore can understand nature, as the M-naturalist might, in this vein, as a mass term. We speak of water, but also the waters of the Great Lakes and that of the Pacific. Wine, yes, but also the wines of France and California. But moving on, we also speak of nature, right? But there's my nature, your nature, and the nature of dogs, hammers, humans, and planets. And thus we see this kind of thread of continuity, which harkens to the principle of continuity, that nature makes no jumps, that, as Strawson says, there's no absolute or radical qualitative discontinuities in nature. So the happy or maybe bizarre consequence for the M-naturalist is maybe this, and I'll end here. Necessarily that which is non-natural has no nature. That which is non-natural has no nature. In some sense, the non-natural, to speak of it anyway, is paradoxically both inexplicable and mysterious. It is that about which none can be, at least rationally said. And so the non-natural is not some separate realm from nature with its own natures. It's no cosmos of its own, but perhaps the opposite of order itself, chaos itself. And that's what I wanted to talk about. That's what's called the uniformity of nature. Okay, so I'll end there, and I think that's kind of where I wanted to go. So I'll stop. Sorry for borrowing any more time than I was allotted. But, I look forward to Bill's comments and everyone else's questions.
Good. Thank you, Matt. Very good. So if you could stop sharing your screen.
Gladly. There we go.
There we go. I will now give a brief comment on the two papers together, and then we can open it up to discussion. And I see already that at least one person has used the chat box to type in the word speak. So if you want to go ahead and do that, please proceed. Heraclitus is reported to have said, "Fusus cryptostai philae," that nature, or whatever he meant by fusus, loves to conceal itself. Behind the two papers we've just heard, we may sense that Mother Nature is smiling at our attempts to pull back the veil, and that those attempts continue to the present. Each paper, Rose Cherubin's Nature, Mortals, and Truth in Parmenides, and Matt Childer's Naturalism and the Uniformity of Nature, is stimulating in its own terms, and I'll try to say why as briefly as I can while I summarize them. But thinking about them together generates some fascinating questions I hope we will have time for. Cherubin begins with a familiar problem in Parmenidean studies, the way of searching endorsed by the goddess, and which is displayed in the poem's chain of deductions, conflicts with, just wanted to confirm something. The way of searching endorsed by the goddess conflicts with, or even ought to exclude, her later remarks about changing observable phenomena. Cherubin reminds us that Parmenides does speak of fusus, but in a way that is not at all consistent with Aristotle's use of the term. Those remarks include 3 uses of fusus and 2 of the corresponding verb fuo. What did Parmenides mean by them, and how are they related to the meaning of the poem as a whole? And full disclosure here, Rose and I have known each other and admired one another's work for many years, and in fact are currently working with about a dozen scholars of ancient thought to put together a collection of essays on the tragic dimensions of Greek philosophy. Nevertheless, I'll try to be as objective as possible. Cherubin first looks at uses of the term fusus that predate, or at least are not later than, Parmenides' poem, including those in Homer, Aeschylus, and Pindar. In none of these cases does fusus connote the nature of a thing in the sense of its essential and explanatory core. The most interesting of these cases for me is the single use of fusus in all of Homer, which comes in Odyssey Book 10, the moly plant with which Odysseus defended himself against the spells of Circe. Moly can't be uprooted, so its source literally cannot be seen. Odysseus is told of the plant's magical powers by Hermes, but the reader is not told what they are. The plant's fusus, and even its identity, if there really was a real botanical item corresponding to the magical herb, remains hidden from human beings, even in its partial revelation to Odysseus. Cherubin sees a similar revelation in the young man's encounter with the goddess. Young man Kouros is how he is referred to in the poem. The key term in her analysis, as I think we heard, is mortals. the opinions of mortals. It's crucially important, I think, to speak not of investigators or early scientists when we talk about the earliest Greek philosophers, but of their concern with mortals. Her conclusion that the goddesses talk of physis highlights those features that reflect the conflicts and gaps that mortals' ways of conceiving the world induce. Our ways of conceiving the world induce these conflicts and gaps. I think that's really well put. Our mortality, then, is a constant condition of lack. That, as she says in her closing line, offers the possibility for inquiry as progressive opening. I find Cherubin's interpretation persuasive. It reminds me of a corresponding ancient problem, that of naming things accurately, which I think she may be alluding to at one point. This problem is much more widely visible in Homer, as in the famous second invocation of the Muses in Iliad Book 2, where the poet admits he could not name all the men and ships without divine assistance. He receives such assistance, but it's clearly meant to be an exception to the limits imposed on ordinary mortals. With those limits on mortals in mind, how then, I want to ask, should we take the revelation given by the goddess to the young man? Why does the Kouros receive it? What does he do or did he do to deserve such knowledge? First, I'd say that, or observe that Parmenides' poem contains what I've elsewhere called a fiction of a private revelation. The poet writes as if the revelation were given privately to him alone, but of course it was meant to be shared, to be public, not private. Why this is can be understood when we view the revelation as both proleptic and broadly ethical. Proleptic in that the young man was not chosen randomly, but has in some way already shown himself worthy of receiving it. And anyone willing to follow the same path can arrive at the same understanding. But here enters the moral or ethical dimension of the revelation. What the young man is given is not an understanding of the whole of nature, as we might put it. Rather, his new knowledge is of the limits in trying to understand the whole, the limits that all human beings face, that, as she puts it, light and dark are in a way fundamental to human experience. And although she does not address this in the paper, her reference to the Prometheus bound, I think, makes the same point. And I would add Xenophanes' fragment 18. Not from the beginning are all things revealed to human beings, but to mortals, but gradually over time we learn more. Let me turn then to the paper by Matt Childers. In his paper, Childers considers whether contemporary metaphysical naturalists and non-naturalists have both failed to address sufficiently the motivations that gave rise to the doctrine of naturalism in the first place, and of a particular form of naturalism, as it turns out. Naturalism, in the words of Suarez, is the belief that nature is all that exists. In other words, that everything that exists is part of nature, and that methods, norms, and or ontological commitments of the natural sciences can be applied to philosophy. To locate the motivation for the doctrine, Childers offers a fascinating and comprehensive history of naturalism. He identifies two broad approaches, which turn out to be conceptual and methodological opposites of one another in many ways: monistic, or M-naturalism, and pluralistic, or P-naturalism. Against most contemporary thinkers, Childers takes up M-naturalism, but does so by showing how both M and P forms can be connected through the principle of the uniformity of nature. This old principle, which Childers sees as neglected, becomes the center focus of his paper. time constraints under which we are working have limited Childers to presenting just a portion of his much longer and really rich paper posted on the conference website. And I urge anyone who has not read it to do so. Its sweep and erudition are very impressive, and we certainly got a good sample of that in the excellent PowerPoint. But sincerely, I think I can learn something from every paragraph of the paper. Childers seeks to connect two familiar, but as he shows, importantly different conceptions of nature. One that takes nature universally or generally, the other taking it in the particular sense in which we speak of the nature of X, which reflects the ancient problem of the one over many, title of today's session. This leads Childers to his core claim about the principle of This leads Childers to his core claim about the principle of uniformity in nature, that it is a metaphysically necessary condition for any X to have a nature, that it is part of nature. And because it makes particular natures intelligible only as part of nature in the universal sense, the uniformity of nature becomes an argument for M-naturalism, even as it identifies a link to P-naturalism that is more than a mere homonymy. And this in turn leads to an extensive consideration in the paper of the analogy between macrocosm and microcosm. As he pointed out, and as we saw in one of the slides, this analogy was once frequently employed in ancient, Renaissance, and modern philosophy, but the analogy fell out of favor because of its unsavory associations with mysticism and esotericism. What was to some thinkers an analogy was to others a reflection of a homology, one that was a key part of Hermeticism. And yet Childers proceeds to argue, as we've just heard, that the M-naturalist should see the relation between the two primary senses of nature as homologous, implying that questionable associations of the past can be avoided. And so my question for Matt is this: how can those less attractive associations be avoided? And why couldn't, beyond that question, why couldn't one charge the defender of M-naturalism with a kind of question begging, assuming the uniformity of nature as a whole in order to argue for it? And if there is a dependency of the particular on the general, why isn't this just a conceptual or logical dependency? If so, we may need to presume such a relationship, even though we cannot justify it. And so instead of speaking of the discovery of nature, as he did briefly at the end of his presentation, maybe we should speak of the invention of nature, where what we are doing is projecting a kind of conceptual limitation of our own onto our experience. That, at any rate, is as much time as I think I should take. I see that there are people who are ready to speak up. So I will thank again Rose and Matt, and we'll turn it over to those of you who are here.
Yeah, I had a question. I was the first that would speak there.
Yes.
Yeah, to Matt, in that list of historical figures associated with micro and macrocosm, or the analogy between the two, one of them was Maimonides. And I'm wondering about how you understand that, because with this notion of the agent intellect and how human beings have, participate in that, you could say, well, there's the micro and macro, but he's a theological thinker, but he's also an apophatic thinker, and so there's a sense that of the deity that goes beyond agent intelligence, which is a lower level, so the lowest of the spheres, sort of thing. And so I'm not sure how accurate it is to lump Maimonides in there by drawing with any sort of analogy between micro and macrocosm. And maybe you could just clarify that for me.
Oh no, I had anticipated that if you put a sufficiently large number of names, if you name drop a sufficiently large number of names, someone who knows better will call call me out, and good on you for doing it. I take that reference from Zemkowski and Wright. What I do know of Maimonides, at least the influence on Spinoza, is I think where I did say that the this analogy is maybe very, very subtle, very very much hinted at, and maybe very loose in among some of those philosophers, maybe more explicit among others. So I maybe completely concede and say that's Maimonides on the list, maybe very much at the bottom of among the so-called endorsers of this relation. Maybe they are expositors of it, or at least acknowledgers of it, or maybe they flap their tongue a little bit in certain places here and there. But I take the rebuke fully, and I'm with you. I'm with you. Oh, that's good. The historians know better.
Sorry, I think the next question comes from Krista Marco.
Hi, I think that's
Wes
me,
DeMarco,
Bill. Wes.
sorry.
Yeah. Oh, that's fine. That's fine. Thanks for calling on me. I didn't realize that I was still up. I have a quick remark to make about the Zoom platform, just to inform everybody. I don't know if anyone else is using, I don't know, your phone and a computer or two different computer accounts, but if you switch between accounts, you lose the chat. I just learned that because I'm going back and forth between two different computers on this.
That happened to me too, Wes. You're not the only one.
A quick word to Rose, just fantastic what I heard of it. I was making brunch, but I listened, and I'm going to read the paper. Just great work as always, and so a voice of approval for your work. My question's for Matthew, and I want to sort of try to pin you between two extremes here. That the homology approach certainly works well for organic beings, and your examples were very suggestive in that regard. If I take, for example, the parts of a proton, right, up, down quark, how is that analogous? I mean, so for example, Tim gave a lovely example in the chat of this kind of phenomenon, and we can cherry pick those throughout the natural order. But if we're looking for nature at large and me or any being as a microcosm of that macrocosm homologously, I worry that homology is either going to slide in one direction towards similarity, and then everything's similarity to everything else in a respect, and so therefore you have that sort of breadth, but not a very useful breadth. Or on the other hand, you go towards towards Lewis and past Lewis, towards use of set theory, modern mereology, ZFC, and then you wind up really with mereological universalism.
Which I'm fine with myself.
Okay.
I mean, in other versions of this paper, I did tread on that a little bit. So I think that's not a. Perhaps you find that distasteful or bizarre. That's great. That's fine.
No, not. I think it's the right consequence for that direction. But it's abstract. It's abstract and formal. So then the way to take it back to me or you, the way in which I'm a microcosm of nature is that I'm a set of sets, like everything else is a set of sets, and that's forgive me, but saying pretty thin gruel. It works. There it is, but. It's certainly not going to please a hermeticist. Maybe that's a good thing too. So anyway, I'm taking up too much time. Thank you very much to both of you. It was a lovely morning here.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that's why the Lewis and other say pluralistic naturalists are so fond of construing worlds set theoretically, and they can't understand the relation as one of homology, but at best an analogy. So I own all of that. I can't say much else to the hard work of doing the project, of how we would cash this out with particle physics or anything else. But those are all great comments, suggestions, and criticisms.
Good. I see Owen Golden is next, then Tim Eastman.
Thanks. Congratulations for two fine papers. I have a short question for Rose, preceded by a shorter comment. And the comment is that when I think about physis in early Greek thoughts, I think about Heraclitus, physis phile kruptasthai, which seems to work very closely with your understanding, where the fus is the whole of things, which is not immediately apparent. And so keeping that in mind might help us with the vexed question of which of the two thinkers is responding to whom or building on whom. But my question has to do with what you see as the implicit distinction in Parmenides between the fundamental principle of explanation and then the derivative characteristics that are explained. So we have the fundamental account of the celestial bodies, and on that basis we can explain their phases and their motions and so forth. So this becomes a very big deal in later Greek thought, the distinction between the principle and that of which the principle is a principle. And it's interesting to see you seeing this in Parmenides, because the cartoon version of Parmenides has noesis of being, and that's it. There is no distinction between primary and secondary kinds of being.
And as Aristotle famously said, no principles.
Right, no principles at all.
Right.
And so my question is whether you think this distinction between principle and that of which a principle is a principle is seen anywhere in the way of truth, and if not, why not?
That's a wonderful question. Thank you. And I'll say just a quick note on the Heraclitus quotation. You may have seen an article by Graham where he argues that the phile, usually translated as loved, actually means sort of to tend to. So it's if it says tends to hide, it doesn't necessarily like it or not. It's not just wants to. It actually, tends to. But yeah, see. I'll say a couple of things. I'm not sure to the extent, and because this would involve some very complicated structural questions. One is there's, as you know, there's some controversy over exactly what the opinions of mortals are supposed to be. Are the opinions simply the claim that what is light and night, or do they also include those things that follow from it? The moon works like this. And, in other words, is it that they've wandered in these initial categorizations but still you can use these, posits though they are, questionable though they are, to kind of, again, as Bill said, sort of derive something based on observation with heuristic efficacy, right? And so, okay, and then, well, you can only do this if you suppose, at least up to a certain point, that inquiry is possible. Now, the opinions of mortals will not support inquiry beyond a certain point, but you can only do this if you suppose that inquiry is possible, which means supposing DK and Anke and Moira and Themis, which support what is being one and continuous and so on. And that's so you get to the next vexed question, which is what are these claims? I mean, if we look at fragment 8 as arguments, here's why it's appropriate to say and conceive that what is one. Well, it's because of what DK does. It prevents things from being created or destroyed. It's because of what an Anke does. It holds everything, together. But also DK governs processes. But also DK, also an Anke governs cause and effect. So where we have these terms, DK and Anke, Moira, etc., that are kind of part of the vocabulary of, or part of the conceptual framework of the opinions of mortals that are being invoked in the section on how to appropriately conceive of what is on a road of inquiry. So I think that the tension that you describe is kind of built in. Because I don't know that there's a resolution, that there's supposed to be a resolution for this in Parmenides. I mean, and because and the reason I say this, I mean, you might ask, well, okay, are you saying that absence of evidence is evidence of absence? No, I'm saying that something forming, as I say, once is a mistake, twice is a habit. Something forming a pattern like that this is so thoroughgoing, it appears mirroring, it appears sort of almost symmetrically in all of these different sections of the poem, including in the proem, might mean that that Parmenides is sort of trying to put up flashing lights. So that's where I am so far, but I'm not sure that that's adequate. But and so let me know if there's any place where I need to be digging a little further, or maybe uncovering something I'm glossing over, and thus obscuring the aletheia.
This is real helpful. Thanks.
Thank you.
Tim Eastman. Be sure to unmute.
Thank you. Yeah, well, thanks to both speakers. I've learned really from both. I've done some reference to Heraclitus. Now I think I have to take a second look at Parmenides. But my comment is like replying to Matthew's fine work. So I'm kind of in the middle. I think that there's some elements of both the P and the M naturalism that I would like affiliate with. And in M naturalism, you might suppose that just being philosophic projections or epistemologically based. And I would suggest that there are some clues as to real ontological basis for the association that comes out of physics inferentially. And that is, on the one hand, the phenomenon of entanglement in quantum physics indicates a holistic linkage that's very fundamental, and that this associates in my description with the non-Boolean descriptions that complement the Boolean descriptions that we need for measurement, but the Boolean relates to actualizations out of the possibilities and the probabilities for particular measurement in quantum physics. So the non-Boolean then is a mapping to the possibility. So we have both the actual and the possible. The actual is very pluralistic, the P monism, and the possibility space is, so to speak, an M a type of M monism, and that the whole put together is sort of some combination of them. And that I think of physical laws as constraints on possibilities, that they're not nomological in the usual sense, they're not somehow God-given, that they're constraints on possibility space. That's how I think of it. So the very fact of physical laws are a reflection of the non-Boolean possibility space that then is a complement to the particular actualizations that then are the set of measurements of particular actualities that we also live in. But in a sense, we live in both because we're grounded in ultimately quantum theoretical, relativistic quantum field theory fundaments in terms of the physics. And this is in this maps both of them. In other words, I don't think you can only have P naturalism.
Well, that's good. I do mention this, at least some reference to this in near the bottom of my paper. I think Jonathan Schaffer has written persuasively that there's a lot in what you've said there to be mined and studied. He plumbs the works of Aspect, Bohm, Bell, and others, and finds that these issues are latent within a lot of that. So I'll refer you to his work as well. But you are absolutely right to say that the controversy keeps you on the fence, because I'm with you more often than not. So that's a very salient and particularly apt point. Yeah, all of that. Thank you.
Notice that we have just two more people waiting to speak, but that it is 12:50. We're supposed to have a lunch break from 1 until 2. So if you want to go get lunch, since you don't have to wait in the cafeteria line, just turn off your camera and do so. But I would like to hear what first Ed Halper and then May Sim have to ask.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the papers from both of you. I have a couple of paradoxes to throw out to you, things that bother me. And I just wonder how you would respond to them. First, for Matt, it seems to me there's a kind of contradiction between the macroscopic and the microscopic views. If you want, on the one hand, you can think of Aristotle, who wants to trace properties, characteristics of a thing to its nature. And that is a kind of microscopic view, or if it's a not really microscopic, but it's a part view. And it's antithetical to the whole view, because if you take the whole view, then the properties of the individual things are due to the whole. So it seems to me that those things are at odds with each other. And you get something of that in Spinoza when he talks about modes, as you mentioned. The mode of the thing was a way of talking about a part that it's not responsible for itself. And it's kind of neat in Spinoza how you can, even though you can't talk about the part, there are ways to somehow divide the whole into intelligible units, but they're not individual parts. So that's the part whole paradox is the one that I want to throw out for you. And for Rose, I want to mention the paradox that Plato explores in the Sophist. Really, if it's the case that there's something that's unintelligible to us mortals here, that even as Heraclitus says, nature is hiding and we're seeing something, or as Parmenides says, we're somehow in the way of seeming, then that very mortal condition is at odds with the monism that each of them are advocating. So my question is, what do you think of this paradox and how to get around the paradox? Is there a way for Parmenides to respond to it? So that's all. Thank you.
Rose, would you like to respond first?
You want Cherubin rushes in where angels fear to tread. So thank you, Ed, for this fantastic question. I would say that, I mean, to me, and this is admittedly, to me, so take that with a grain of salt. It looks like the monism is not meant to be, or is at least not clearly meant to be, an unproblematic, unconditional final statement of Parmenides' own views. I don't see it as that. I see it as more of a sort of given this given the conceptual framework from which we start, where we identify a world of humans and goddesses and chariots and DK and Anke and Moira and horses and stars and sun, it appears that we need to assume that what is one and continuous and unmoving in order for inquiry to be possible. It also appears that we need to assume some things that don't fit very well with that. So in other words, I don't see this as as Parmenides advancing an unconditional statement as to the nature of what is. And that may sound somewhat anachronistic, but I don't think it is. I mean, I think we have precedent for that in Xenophanes and either precedent or contemporaneity in this with Heraclitus, and we certainly see reflections of that in Zeno and Melissus. So, which I could go into at length, but I'm not going to do now. If the monism, and I correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Matt is running into something like this as well in what he's done. Matt, correct me or laugh or something if this is completely off the mark. But it looks like any attempt to endorse the M naturalism is going to have to invoke a conceptual vocabulary from the P naturalism and vice versa. And the very notion of order and homology would suppose that whatever we need to would involve the supposition that what we need in order for inquiry to be possible is in place, and that there are these sort of there's that we can ask about these things and come up with true answers, but yet at the same time those requisites might be in conflict with one side or the other. So I'm just wondering if that's so I'm seeing Parmenides as kind of maybe a gesture, perhaps not with an adequate vocabulary in that kind of direction, because it is very different from what you're seeing in Homer and what you're seeing in Aeschylus and what you're seeing in even as we move into Heraclitus and further on, we're seeing a progression in these sort of questions about, as Bill put this, how rightly to name things, and if that's possible to name things rightly and unproblematically. So I don't think that's an answer. I think, and this could be just that sort of my level of mortal limitation is kind of higher than a lot of people's, and I should just leave this to people that are less mortally limited. But on the other hand, this is where I'm at. This is the short version of where I'm at now. And I don't think that's going to be satisfying. It's the short version of where I'm at now. And it's, you're just, I'm grateful to you for inspiring me to continue to pursue that.
And I'll say, Ed, quickly, those are good points, good questions. I'm agnostic on Aristotle. I go back and forth myself. I think there's good evidence for both cases to see, you know, in certain places in the physics and metaphysics to see Aristotle maybe as a monist of some sort, and other places in the same texts say no, he can't be because he says other things too. So you know, again, that's my professed agnosticism, but that's a good question, and I'm wondering with you right along.
May Sim.
Thanks so much to both of you. I very much appreciated your talks. And I think that I want to push you guys a little bit, maybe just in a different way than Ed Halper had just done, because I always follow him, not only in timing, but also in thought. And, you know, Rose, I so much appreciate your pointing out and interpretation of how fundamental both lightness and darkness are to the human experience. And but I want to bring you back to the way of the truth, and how it is that eventually, you know, one of these can be named and the other not. And I had always read that passage about lightness and light and dark as form and matter, and how it is that matter just isn't something that can be named. It's not something that is intelligible. And as a result of that, even if you want to illuminate and highlight our mortality in the Parmenides, and how it is that it's that contributes to our ability to move toward the intelligible. I mean, how do you explain the fact that matter and darkness is ultimately unintelligible and unnameable? It's just not anything definite. And along the same lines for Matt, likewise, what is it that makes all of these things, you know, share the same nature? Where what is it that contributes to their uniformity is, you know, not in itself something that we could even unify. I mean, the parts, like Ed was saying, don't help to propel us toward the unity that then defines each and every one of these things. What is it that would contribute to the individual shapes and forms of the individual entities, so that they don't just blur into a whole collection of parts and things of the same sort of material, which, if we go to Rose's paper, is leaves us completely in the dark.
Thank you, Mel. What a beautiful question. And certainly no time to really delve into it, but thank you just for putting that so perspicuously. I mean, this is a thing I've been grappling with, and you just said it so crystallized so beautifully. So thank you. As always, I mean, this is why I'm so always excited to see May at a conference. I know something great like that will happen. So a couple of things. One is, I mean, there is some, as you know, there is some controversy about that line about one of the forms being unnameable, and does it mean one specific, namely the dark, is unnameable, or does it mean, well, okay, mortals go wrong in naming either of them, because once you name either of them, you have to name the other one. So, I mean, both of those would be a problem, but they're slightly different problems. And you're raising, I think, implicitly both problems. So yeah, so one, I think that most of the environment around Parmenides would probably say that, yeah, look, dark is the one that, or night would be the thing, or the side of the division that is sort of it seems like you'd be going wrong in naming it because it seems like it's a privation. But Parmenides interestingly doesn't represent it as a privation. So he's bringing something out to us. In other words, light has specific aspects. It's bright, it's lightweight, but dark, it's not just the absence of light. It's, well, okay, it's heavy, it's ponderous, it's impenetrable, right? It's dark colored. So each of them is sort of named positively, asserted positively, if you will. I don't mean positively ethically, but just positively. Each has so in other words, we don't have a sort of fullness and privation scheme. Do we have a form and matter scheme, or what? If that's what's, let's say, and I don't know that that's what will be going on in Parmenides, but if we have any inkling of it, and I'll say quickly why I don't think that's what's going on, but if we did, it would be saying, well, look, and something Aristotle did try to make, you wouldn't be able to intuit form without matter, right? I mean, you need something. In other words, the form is a form of something. It's even if the matter is not sensible matter. I mean, even, a circle is an infinite number of points, and so is a line, but they're different. I mean, they're perfect circle, perfect geometric line, but they're different. So they're different arrangements of infinite number of points. So I think in Parmenides, where you don't specifically necessarily have form, is exactly that. Okay, first of all, that both light and night can cause obscuring, and both light and night can cause revealing, or can lead to revealing, and they need to interact. So they need to interact in a certain way. But then, so the unnameable is then sort of part of the same, or the unidentifiable, just as in the Homer example, is part of the same complex, part of the same. He's bringing out that part of the same conception of a whole that the nameable would be. So to have something nameable means you need something unnamed or unnameable to some extent, because otherwise, because you need to distinguish the named thing from, well, what? Not nothing. Or if it is nothing, still, okay. And that's, of course, Milesus's problem. And that's where I say this gets into Milesus. So I don't want to go too far down that road, but that's where I am. And I would love to hear further reflections and especially corrections as to where I'm just veering wildly off course. So thank you. That is so beautiful and so helpful. And unfortunately for you all, you have inspired me to look further into these things and develop this further. So, be aware that I might actually, burden some with that. Thank you. Thank you.
I'll say, May, my answer to the question would be disappointing, given how I think well pointed it was, and it got very quickly to I think one of the most central issues that I myself have a hard time even thinking about, much less speaking about as well as you did. So instead of giving you a disappointing answer, which would disappoint me, I'll praise your question as being a damn good one, because it's one that you're swimming in that I barely have the courage to dip my toe in. So that's I think a really good point, especially in the matter of relating to uniformity. So it's very apt. Yeah, I will with great respect shrug my shoulders and give that question, punt the question back to better minds capable of handling this, like Rose's and yours. So.
Well, on that note, I think we will close out the session. Thank you to both of our speakers,
Thank you to all.
Rose and Matt.
Thanks,
Excellent
everybody.
papers, very, very stimulating.
And thanks to you, Bill, for, as always, very clear and well-timed, well-paced comments and sharing of the session. Thanks to all.
You're welcome very much.
Great job,
Thank
Bill.
you so much.
Okay, good.
Thanks, everybody.
Look forward to seeing you around. Bye-bye.